And this is a gas leak in a house, a report of a gas leak. The emergency responders have arrived on the scene. This actually is in slow motion. And so now you see it, now you don't. And so that's kind of your worst case on a gas or natural gas accumulating in a structure. But as you can see, it's a different scale of damage. And I like to say, you know, the difference between is that a disaster? Well, it's a disaster for anybody who was standing in front of the building or was in the building. It's certainly not a San Bruno. But there is that possible outcome, even on a mundane incident involving natural gas distribution systems. So, distribution line incidents, the fire service, as I said, because they're more frequent, we have more experience with them. There's a couple of challenges. The first is that often we don't know where the leak is coming from, particularly if you're in an urbanized area. There may be a lot of infrastructure underground, and so you may have natural gas migrating through sewer systems, all kinds of other underground passageways, and so it may be tough to isolate the location of the leak. Distribution pipelines are not marked. Unlike transmission lines. There's several incidents in the NTSB where you had migration of gas from an underground leak into a structure resulting in a catastrophic explosion. And again, even though they are distribution lines, you can have feeder lines that operate at higher pressures that are still going to give you a significant fireball if they ignite. And so all those are real concerns for distribution line incidents. So third-party excavation meaning excavation by someone other than the operator of the pipeline or someone contracted by them to do excavation. Now, the implementation of one-call systems in the U.S., we have a number for that, 811. 811 is not that here in Canada, but you do have a one-call system. I've got a link to that later. I think at each province level you have this, and the point behind that is that if you're going to be doing excavation, which would be really, if you're going to be strict about it, as simple as you're going to get a post hole borer and you're going to start putting up a fence in your backyard, you should be calling. And then they will come out and they will mark any underground utilities so that any excavators coming in will be aware of that and hopefully not damage them. Third-party excavation, and the numbers appear to be going down since the widespread implementation of the one-call systems, but 4% of accidents, the fourth leading category for hazardous liquid pipelines, 12.5% for gas transmission lines, and for distribution lines was 30%. So as you see, it's a bigger threat to the distribution lines in large measure because they're not marked and they're much more ubiquitous, right? And so you get the casual person who's doing some work on their property has got a much better shot at hitting a natural gas distribution line than a transmission line. And those are just some photographs from different incidents showing excavators at work. Okay, so hopefully by this point we've motivated some of the concerns about why we need to be on the pipeline issue and what are some of the things that can happen. So where we did a lot of our analysis and our research was looking at the communication impacts, and we're going to talk about the method that we used to understand the communication, and that will translate into what will hopefully be actionable information for you to apply these techniques in your own communities. And the approach that we call is, the acronym for it is SAIRA, or S-A-I-R-A, Situation Awareness Information Requirements Analysis, which we will discuss. So communication, when we think about it, for a pipeline incident and for a lot of emergencies can be fairly complex, right? And so we have really 4 totally different and diverse constituent groups that are involved in communication for a pipeline emergency, right? If we look at the top, we have pipeline operators, which should be self-evident, But who are the operators? Well, that can be a lot of things, right? They can be management, it can be supervisors, it can be operators, it can be control room or SCADA operators, it can be pipeline personnel in the field, and it can be company responders, right? And so even within what we would say, you know, a monolith, a pipeline operator, there are multiple roles that fit under that category. On the right, you have various public groups that may be involved in communication. They may not necessarily be initial reporters, but if you are going to have an incident and you're going to manage an incident, in all likelihood they are going to be involved. And that would include, obviously, nearby residents. It may include visitors who aren't located in that area whole time, but may be passing through. There was an incident in New Mexico where there were people camping adjacent to a natural gas pipeline right away. And there was a rupture of the pipeline, and they were killed. And there was an issue because they shouldn't have been there in the first place, but the fire services weren't aware that there were people in proximity. They can be community leaders, employees, people who work in proximity to a pipeline, people who perform services, media, etc. On the left, we have emergency responders, and it's important to include all the diversity within the emergency response community, right? We like to think this is a fire service problem. Well, it's really much bigger than a fire service problem, right? And most notably, what often gets left out is dispatch, right? And you have to include your 911 operators, your dispatchers. They are critical. They are the first ones who are going to be getting this information, and they're the ones who are going to make or break you in terms of the incident. They're also the ones who are in all likelihood going to be reaching out to the pipeline operator. We have law enforcement, right? Law enforcement is crucial. Same issues. They may be early on the scene. If you have a large incident, they're going to be involved in potentially diverting traffic, potentially doing evacuation. And we'll talk about role versus affiliation on the next slide. But depending on the incident, these roles and these may merge. We talk about the different roles here, but there are agencies. We'll get into that a little further. Emergency medical services, broader public safety to include emergency management, and then environmental responders, right? Because of the distinct environmental component of pipeline emergencies, you may have environmental agencies at the provincial or the federal level who are responding to your incident, right? And how many incidents do we normally deal with in the fire service that draw a provincial or federal response on the initial alarm? Not very many. So it's not an everyday occurrence. And then lastly, but not least, and really importantly, are other companies. And this would include construction firms, which is typically the excavators who are causing leaks, but also other utility companies. And one of the things we found is that many times utilities, pipelines, may be located adjacent to electric lines. They may have underground electrical cables that are near pipelines, and most importantly, there may be multiple pipelines from different operators in or near the same right-of-way. And so just another layer of complication on here. And there have been cases where an arcing electrical line ended up breaching a natural gas pipeline. So one of the tenets of the situation awareness information requirements analysis is the notion of role versus affiliation, right? And so the first thing we're going to do is we will say we're going to put our patch aside, the color of our uniform, and we're now going to look at the roles, the various roles that are fulfilled. So if we look at the first one, the initial receipt of notification by the pipeline operator. Now this is in the case where the pipeline operator is the first to have information on a leak or release, and then they are contacting the emergency responder. And that can be a pipeline field person making contact with their office. It can be that office contacting the first responder, or it can be that person in the field contacting them directly. the role of controlling the pipeline release, and these roles, by the way, were identified in a series of workshops with representatives from the pipeline industry as well as emergency responders, and we came up with a list of them that's in the guide. We've got the most important ones here that we're talking about today. Controlling a pipeline release. Whose job is that? Is it always done by the pipeline operator? In the fire service, do we ever control a pipeline release? Well, if you have a distribution line, right, service to a house, do we ever go in and clamp that off? We may, right? So the point of that is that we may be involved in this role even if we're not a pipeline operator, right? And so there are times when, depending on who gets there first, the nature of the incident, the product involved, when these roles can be fulfilled by multiple organizational affiliations. Public protective and response actions can be any of the on-scene personnel, right? The fire service, law enforcement, emergency management, or the pipeline operator, right? What's an example of a pipeline operator getting involved in public protective and response actions? Well, you've got a natural gas distribution line problem. They're out on the scene, they knock on the door, they smell the gas, they get there first, they say, hey, you know, everybody get out of the building. Okay? That's a public protective action. So the importance of looking at it by role is that when we typically think about affiliations, we like to build boxes, and we say, well, the pipeline operators, that's their job, they do this, they turn valves, that's all they do, and they come in to provide expertise. You know, we're the fire service, we do all these things. Well, the reality is it's a much more complex picture, and so we need to plan based on role, not based on affiliation. The other issue, of course, is that these organizational duties vary across the United States. While they're largely similar, some organizations don't do all these things, and that mix may indeed be different. We had an example in New York City. We had an indoor natural gas leak which ended up destroying, I think, a 5-story apartment building, caused several fatalities. Prior to that, there was a policy in place in New York City where the fire service was not notified of all natural gas odor calls from the local utility. After that incident, they decided that the fire service would be notified and they would respond. And that's been tens of thousands of additional responses that the New York City Fire Department goes on because of that policy change. The last one, federal and state support for environmental protection. There's a whole laundry list here. You can have a state or provincial pipeline regulator. You can have a state or provincial environmental agency. You can have the federal resources. And then what about waterways, right? Many of these pipelines are maybe adjacent to water. And as a consequence, you may have need for water-based resources, so a Coast Guard or whatever civil authority is going to be responsible for mitigation of releases that occur on or near water. And in fact, in waterborne incidents in the U.S., the Coast Guard is the primary responder. So it's a federal authority starting first, which flies in the face of everything that we normally deal with. So we boiled down all the decisions that need to be made, and again, this is the initial stages of the incident, right? This is not, a month into the cleanup. This isn't even a day into the cleanup. These are the stages when we're trying to find out what's going on. The first seems obvious, but as we saw from San Bruno, it's not always obvious. Do we have a pipeline emergency? Right? This is the question that's got to be in the back of your mind when that phone rings. Where is the leak or release? Right? We saw now that person on that call from Santa Barbara was actually better than most. Right? I don't know if any of you, if you listen to 911 calls, people on cell phones, right? I mean, they're terrible, right, in terms of being able to give you meaningful direction. And of course, transmission lines tend to be out in the boondocks, right? And so it's in the middle of a field. Right? And so you get a guy from New York City, I had to call somebody, it's like, I don't know, it's grass next to a fence, I don't know where the hell I am, so those are typical issues. Who do we notify? Who's the appropriate emergency response organization, right? A typical pipeline may run through hundreds